May 1945. Nazi Germany has collapsed. Cities smolder, and armies that once swept across Europe stand down. Millions of German soldiers suddenly find themselves disarmed, bewildered, and reduced overnight from combatants to captives. In the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender, the victorious Allies faced an unprecedented problem. What to do with this human tide? Where would these men be taken? How would they be treated? And when and how could they return home? The answers varied sharply, depending on who captured them and where. This is the story of the ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers, the prisoners of the Reich, and the long, often tragic paths they followed through Allied hands into the post-war world. It is a story of logistics and politics, of law and retribution, of survival and slow return, a story that shaped post-war Europe and the lives of millions. When Berlin fell in early May 1945 and Germany surrendered, vast numbers of Wehrmacht troops were already surrounded or cut off. In the weeks leading up to victory, Allied armies had taken hundreds of thousands of prisoners on the move. In the final hours and days of the war, this swell became a flood. Some armies surrendered en masse or were captured in pocket battles, while many small surrender events dotted the map as German units laid down arms everywhere. Within a few weeks, millions of German soldiers were at the mercy of the Allies. In Western Europe, primarily the American, British, and French zones, makeshift enclosures, training grounds, and open fields ringed by barbed wire were pressed into service to hold them. Perhaps the largest of these were the U.S. Rhine-Wiesenlager, Rhine meadow camps, established in Germany's Rhineland. These 19 camps, run by the U.S. Army and officially designated as temporary enclosures for disarmed enemy forces, held between 1 and almost 2 million surrendered soldiers from April through September 1945. To cope with the flood, Eisenhower decreed that these captives would be classified as disarmed forces, not prisoners of war, a legal distinction meant to sidestep Geneva Convention requirements for POWs. Across the continent, Allied soldiers had the immediate task of disarming, registering, feeding, and guarding this enormous human tide. The Western Allies, the U.S., Britain, and France, strove, amid chaos, to establish order in their zones. They set up processing and transit camps, segregated officers from enlisted men, inventoried weapons and uniforms, and tried to feed and shelter the prisoners according to some basic standards. Despite the wreckage of Europe and severe supply shortages, the Western Allies generally aimed to operate within the framework of the Geneva Conventions, as they chose to apply them. Food and medical care were limited but usually provided. German POWs were put to work under Allied direction, on farms, on clearing rubble, repairing infrastructure, and other reconstruction tasks, a use of labor expressly permitted, with conditions, by the Hague and Geneva Conventions. For many thousands of POWs, life in these camps became a routine of roll calls, work details, guards, and daily struggles with boredom and limited rations. Yet even here, small acts of normalcy emerged. Camp orchestras and choirs performed German marches and songs. Prisoners formed sports teams, staged theatrical productions, and ran camp schools to learn languages or study politics. Allied officers often organized lectures on democracy or discussions of Nazi crimes in an effort at re-education. As one veteran chaplain recalled of his camp experience in the U.S., 3 years in the camp were no lost, useless time for us, but a lifting experience. Many former POWs would later say that they emerged from captivity convinced of democracy, having been treated as humanely as circumstances allowed. By contrast, millions of German soldiers fell into Soviet hands on the Eastern Front. From 1941 through spring 1945, the Red Army captured vast numbers in successive offensives. By the end of the war, roughly 3 million Wehrmacht soldiers were in Soviet custody. Many more died in battle on the Eastern Front, making it the bloodiest theater of the war. In the devastated Soviet Union, these POWs were seen as a critical labor pool for reconstruction. They were sent deep into the USSR to work in forestry, mining, and rebuilding projects under NKVD secret police supervision. Soviet camps for German POWs were modeled on the Gulag system, though in theory promised better treatment and even some nominal observance of international law. In practice, conditions were harsh. Winter in Siberia, chronic food shortages, disease, and grueling labor took a terrible toll. Historians estimate that the death rate in Soviet captivity was extremely high. Soviet records eventually reported about 381,000 German POW deaths, while German post-war commissions later estimated that up to 1.09 million German POW deaths servicemen died in Soviet camps. Precise figures remain disputed, as many records are still incomplete or lost. In any case, the vast majority of German POWs taken in 1945 were still alive but detained after the war. Unlike the Western Allies, the USSR did not return most of them quickly. The survivors were released in phases over many years, with the last groups only coming home in the mid-1950s. In short, where a German soldier fell at surrender determined his fate. In the West, armies swept down through Germany and Czechoslovakia and took prisoners who were then marched or trucked to Allied camps. In the East, Soviet offensives or local partisans did likewise. The Western Allies, stretched by both the influx of prisoners and the chaos of liberated Europe, often found their camps grossly overcrowded. For example, at one Rhine meadow camp in Remagen, a site built for 100,000 men swelled to 184,000. Supply lines were strained, huts or tents often had to do for shelter, and initially meals might be meager, sometimes a handful of bread or watery soup. Allied policy officially aimed to give each POW at least the minimum rations and shelter required by the Geneva Rules. But in practice, many camps in early 1945 resembled refugee camps. Prisoners slept on the ground, dug slit trenches for cover, and scrounged for any extra food they could get. Some died of exposure, disease, or malnutrition in those chaotic weeks. British historians still debate how many perished in the Rhine meadow camps and on their marches. The Allied occupation zones in Germany were flooded with prisoners of war. Historians estimate that by September 1946, Britain alone held over 400,000 German prisoners, mostly enlisted men. The United States, during and just after the war, hosted roughly 425,000 German POWs in nearly 700 camps scattered across the country. France also held very large numbers. In mid-1945, the U.S. transferred some 740,000 POWs to France for forced labor, mainly removing mines and rebuilding infrastructure. Across all Western Allied forces, including the British Commonwealth and the French Empire, millions of German soldiers were interned in the summer and autumn of 1945. The U.S. Army and its allies sought to make order of this chaos. In Western Europe, the first step was often to collect prisoners into holding areas. Soldiers would search and disarm surrendered units, then march or truck the men to nearby fields or vacant barracks. There they were recorded, name, rank, unit, given a standardized uniform or blanket, and assigned a POW serial number. Medical officers would examine them. Those who were sick, wounded, or underweight might be evacuated to hospitals or separate enclosures. Others remained in open-air enclosures, surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by Allied troops. Once swept into the camp system, most German prisoners found themselves assigned to work details. Under the Hague and Geneva Conventions, captors could require able-bodied POWs to perform non-military labor, with some guarantees on pay, conditions, and health. The Allies took full advantage. In Britain and France, armies and civilian authorities dispatched POW work gangs all over the countryside, repairing bombed farms and roads, clearing rubble from cities, dismantling fallen factories, and, most famously, demining fields and coasts. These tasks were often dangerous. In France and Denmark in 1945-46, thousands of German POWs clearing mines were wounded or killed. In the British zone of Germany, orders went out that all enlisted POWs, except exempt officers, were to work. By mid-1946, Some 163,000 German POWs in Britain were laboring on farms, thousands more in construction and other tasks. In fact, at its peak, the British occupation authorities used POWs for about 20–25% of all farm labor in the UK, nearly one German prisoner of war on every 4 British fields. In the United States, camp labor was often on farms and ranches in the surrounding communities. Germany's high harvests during the war had left the American Midwest with a shortage of farmhands, so local farmers eagerly petitioned for POW labor. Some prisoner of war camps were set up with adjacent farmland. Americans note that the food and living conditions inside U.S. camps, however austere by German standards, were often far better than what the troops had seen in war zones. Prisoners were fed at least military rations, given bedrolls and sometimes heated barracks. They also had a bit of pocket money, around 80 cents per day, for canteen purchases. Many U.S. camp reports emphasize that captives cooperated well on farm teams. Geneva rules forbid officers from being forced to work, but non-com officers could still volunteer or be assigned. France's need for labor was acute in ruined regions such as Alsace and the devastated Champagne. French commanders, remembering the years of German slave labor in France, were determined to make use of the captured Wehrmacht soldiers. Under agreements with the Americans, the French drew POW work gangs from Allied holding camps in the western zones. Over 1 million German prisoners would eventually pass through French hands, many of them directed to dismantle industries, rebuild roads and railways, and clear explosive ordnance. One historian notes that callous self-interest and a desire for retribution often governed these policies. French authorities calculated that around 2,000 German POWs were being maimed or killed each month, clearing mines or working in harsh conditions. The Americans even transferred some of the Rhine meadow prisoners directly to France. By late 1945, they estimated that 740,000 had gone to French labor programs, often already weakened by months of captivity. Throughout the Western camps, life followed a pattern. Each camp was run by Allied military units, but the prisoners themselves did much of the internal work. Often German NCOS and officers set up camp leadership councils under oversight of the captors. A German cook corps prepared meals, provided by Allied kitchens. German doctors treated the sick, with supplies from the Red Cross or medical officers, and even German military police, Feldjäger, sometimes served as internal camp guards. Allied intelligence screened the prisoners for war criminals, SS men, camp guards, etc., who might be separated out for trial. But for rank-and-file soldiers, the emphasis was on management and productive work. Importantly, the Western Allies generally kept to the letter of international law by segregating officers, who were not to be compelled to work, and by not beating or starving the prisoners. Relations between guards and captives were often formal, but not brutal. In many U.S. camps, the sight of heavily armed American guards impressed the Germans, but once under control, relatively normal routines prevailed. American records later noted that after working on farms or in factories, many German POWs had positive feelings about the country where they were held, learned English, and even accumulated some savings from their wages. In Britain, although discipline was strict, relatively few prisoners died in captivity compared to other countries, and British officers ran re-education classes, civic lectures, or language courses in an attempt to expose men to democratic ideas. Ultimately, about 25,000 of the German POWs in Britain chose to stay on as civilian workers or students after release. Not all accounts of Allied treatment were glowing. In the first frantic weeks of May, June 1945, even the Western camps were brutally overcrowded. Guards sometimes lacked bedding or clothes to issue. Tens of thousands slept in foxholes or shivered under open skies. Hygiene was precarious. Many capture site enclosures, especially the Rhine meadow camps in the U.S. zone, are remembered as cruel makeshifts, men digging themselves holes in the mud to sleep, suffering dysentery and hunger. Only gradually could the Allies bring in supplies and trucks to evacuate the camps, release wounded or high-risk prisoners, and improve food rations. Official policy in the West was generally to follow the Geneva Convention, but in practice, supply bottlenecks, transport limits, and the scale of displacement caused harsh conditions for several months after surrender. Many historians still debate exactly how many prisoners died or suffered in that initial chaos. Some argue deaths numbered in the tens of thousands, but all agree it was a serious humanitarian strain. On the Eastern Front, the story was very different. From mid-1941 onward, the Red Army captured German troops by the hundreds of thousands and sometimes millions in a single battle, such as 91,000 at Stalingrad, of whom only about 6,000 ever returned. By the final surrender of Germany, roughly 3 million Wehrmacht soldiers were interned in the Soviet Union. These men were overwhelmingly used as forced labor. Thousands were herded in line with Soviet civilians to fell timber, lay railroad tracks, clear bomb craters, dig canals, and mine coal under NKVD guard. The Soviets, who had suffered frightful losses, estimates of 27 million dead, including civilians, saw in these POWs a means to rebuild their shattered economy. Soviet policy toward German POWs was complex. Officially, Stalinist doctrine and existing pre-war law treated POWs as potential political rogues to be re-educated into anti-fascism. In practice, over the 1945-48 period, the great majority of German prisoners worked alongside the Gulag labor system, albeit in separate camps, the GUPVI camps run by the NKVD. Soviet officials claimed to honor some Geneva principles, even though the USSR was not a signatory. For example, they mostly segregated officers from enlisted men and exempted officers from compulsory labor, and they provided rations comparable to those of similar-ranking Red Army soldiers. In theory, any German soldier who showed extreme loyalty to the USSR might be treated a bit better. Some POWs were allowed to form the so-called National Committee for a Free Germany and received privileges. But in general, the labor regime was harsh. Prisoners cleared minefields, with tens of thousands maimed or killed in France, Denmark, the USSR, toiled in northern camps with frozen mud for floors and minimal wood for heat, and often got only scant bread and soup. How many perished in Soviet captivity? Soviet archives after 1991 disclosed 381,000 German POW deaths in their camps. However, German investigations have produced much higher figures. A West German commission in the 1960s concluded that 3.06 million Germans had been taken by the USSR and about 1.09 million died there. Eminent historian Rüdiger Overmans, after exhaustive study, put the confirmed deaths at about 363,000 based on official files, but judged it plausible that up to 700,000 more missing men died in Soviet hands. In short, modern scholars estimate that perhaps half of all German POWs held by the Soviets eventually died. The precise mortality remains uncertain, since many Soviet records are incomplete, but even the lowest estimates attest to a scale of tragedy far above anything in the Western camps. The Soviet Union did eventually begin returning prisoners of war, but very slowly. The first releases, in 1946-47, favored the sick, wounded, or very old, and the handful of Germans who cooperated politically. By 1948, the USSR announced that most prisoners held in the European USSR were free to go, but actually many able-bodied men were kept on in labor detachments as late as 1950. Only after the advent of the Cold War did the issue become a diplomatic focus. West German leaders continuously pleaded for their return. Finally, in September 1955, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer visited Moscow. In exchange for formal diplomatic recognition of East Germany, the Soviets agreed to release the last large group of German detainees. The result was astonishing. The final 10,000 or so holdouts still in Russian camps were suddenly released and flown home. It was 10 years after the end of the war, the last soldiers of the Great War finally coming back in limping buses through the gates of the Friedland reception camp. Their arrival, and the tearful reunions that followed became a national event in a Germany that thought it would never see these men again. What was daily life like for these captives? In broad outline, POW camps everywhere developed their own orders and rhythms, mixing military habits with prison routine. Prisoners improvised army-style organizations, former sergeants ran work details, released officers tried to keep discipline among younger men, and local soldier committees handled chores like kitchens or latrines under guard supervision. Despite captivity, many held on to their military bearing. A returning POW from 1955 was still standing in stiff ranks as he crossed the border. Indoors in the camps, there was always something to do. In the West, Allied authorities often provided or tolerated cultural activities. Camp theaters and concert halls were common in U.S. and British camps. In one American camp, former Luftwaffe airmen produced an orchestral concert each month. In another, POWs built a racing car that raced at a local fair. Seminars on democracy, book clubs, sports leagues, and informal universities sprang up, even while overhead watchtowers eyed every move. Many prisoners treasured the rare letters or postcards home which were delivered through the Red Cross with unpredictable delays, and so those made the rounds at camp like prized literature. Work assignments defined much of the day. A German note from a U.S. camp in 1945 read, 5 a.m. roll call, breakfast, to work, dinner, back to camp, study English, supper, lights out. In Western camps, work was generally not treated as punishment. Farmers guarded by a few armed soldiers worked side by side with the POW teams in the fields. German workers note that in Britain and America, the Germans often performed as diligent if tired partners in rebuilding agriculture and industry. When their shifts ended, they returned to camp each evening, sometimes even billeted on the farms in summer. In camp itself, prisoners formed guard details, kitchen crews, and maintenance squads. They kept gardens to supplement food, held Bible study or Nazi newspaper reading circles, and snatched moments to write diaries. The prison authorities tried to keep POWs busy, and sometimes provided schooling. In many British camps, officers taught history or basic sciences. In the Soviet camps, life was far tougher. There was little room for leisure. German soldiers described bleak barracks, or dugouts, and endless work shifts at sawmills, mines, or collective farms, kolkhozes. Russian camp regulations often forced POWs to perform the hardest manual labor, and any infraction, like missing work, could mean beatings or solitary confinement. Even so, some prisoners quietly organized things like sports games when guards allowed, or church services in hidden corners. One longtime detainee wrote that the will to survive had to be found by ourselves, and that memories of home and hope of return were the only comforts. Escapes did happen, especially in the early chaotic days. Hundreds of the Rhine meadow camp's escapees famously ran into woods or over the border, though almost all were recaptured. One legendary case was Georg Gertner, who slipped out of a U.S. camp in New Mexico in 1945 to avoid being sent into the Soviet zone. He lived under a false identity until 1985. Punishments for attempted escapes were severe everywhere. Guard reports from Allied camps mention dozens of German inmates condemned or shot for violent defiance, and in the East, captured escapees could be sent to strict penal Strafbat, disciplinary battalions, or treated as criminals. Yet even prisoners learned to survive by asserting some control. Secret committees ran internal bread rationing when supplies ran low. Barter networks, soap for bread, cigarettes for letters, kept a shadow economy alive. Some camps allowed camp currency, or work notes. Others paid tiny wages deposited in Red Cross accounts. Medical care was sparse, but often provided by German doctors with Allies' medicines for the worst cases. Above all, men tried to keep hope alive with small acts of defiance, songs around a fire, clandestine letter exchanges, or memorizing foreign phrases. In U.S. camps after 1945, it was noted that many prisoners ended up with enough English to feel confident speaking with Americans. In the cold of the Soviet winter, men huddled together in bunkrooms, sharing stolen wood or matches to burn. The process of returning these men home was a vast logistical undertaking. In Western Europe, repatriation moved comparatively quickly. The Americans began sending ships full of German POWs back across the Atlantic as soon as port facilities were free. By late 1945, most Americans in U.S. camps were already being loaded onto troop ships bound for Hamburg or Brest. The British held off releasing all their prisoners until September 1946, partly due to domestic labor needs, but then began intensive repatriation. Ships and trains carried the Germans back to the devastated Rhine Valley and Berlin's ruins. According to official figures, by the end of 1948, nearly all German POWs held by the U.S. or Britain had been released, and virtually all those held by France by late 1949. In practice, the journey home often took weeks per man. A sick POW might go via Belgium or the Netherlands, travel on a hospital train, then be admitted to a German receiving camp, like Friedland, for medical checkup, debriefing, and placement. Most released POWs returned directly to the ruins of their homeland. West Germany in 1946-47 was a shock. Cities destroyed, farms abandoned, families living in cellars or military huts. Many former soldiers had not even written home since the winter of 1944 and had no clue where their loved ones were. Some went to refugee camps or relatives far from home. A surprising number faced stigma, however involuntary. Many people in Germany associated returning POWs with the defeated Nazi army. Others, especially those whose homes now lay in the Soviet zone or in newly expelled territories, could not go home at all. Meanwhile, the thousands of German POWs returning from Eastern captivity came back one group at a time, often frail and aged by long years of captivity. After 1948, the Soviet releases trickled on. Officials would airlift or send trains carrying retired officers or A-men, leaving behind able-bodied youth. It wasn't until Konrad Adenauer's diplomacy in 1955 that the final chapter closed. On September 14, 1955, busloads of the last soldiers of the Great War rolled into West Germany with fanfare. Families who had been searching for fathers and sons for a decade wept on seeing them at Friedland camp. Onlookers marveled at the strange sight of young men still in their 1940s uniforms after 10 years. The press captured the moment of reunion in every town. One Die Zeit reporter noted with emotion how these veterans still saluted and sang old marches, as if frozen in 1945. Returning prisoners then faced a second war, the struggle to rebuild lives in peacetime. The economy in Germany was shattered, housing was scarce, jobs even more so. A man who spent years in a Siberian camp arrived to find his home bombed out and his wife remarried. Many former POWs suffered from malnutrition's long-term effects, or from frostbite and diseases caught in captivity. Psychologically, the trauma was significant. Decades later, studies note that many veteran POWs were haunted by nightmares, distrustful of authority, or plagued by survivors' guilt, aware their suffering paled next to that of concentration camp victims. Socially, there was tension over how to remember the POWS ordeal. In the first years after the war, German public discourse was understandably focused on Nazi guilt and the crimes of the regime. The plight of ordinary German soldiers was a sensitive subject. Some Germans understandably saw POWs as victims. Others feared dwelling on it might downplay Germany's own aggression. Over time, however, an understanding emerged that these men's experiences were part of the war's human toll. Survivors' associations formed, memoirs were published, and politicians acknowledged the sacrifices. In West Germany by the late 1950s, there was even a small stream of remembrance payments for former POWs. A U.S. law provided limited back pay for German soldiers held by Americans, and West Germany likewise offered compensation to those who had worked as forced labor for the Allies. Historians today try to integrate the POW story into the larger narrative. They note, for instance, that life in captivity could hardly be called light. Even in US and British camps, hundreds of prisoners died from war wounds or epidemics, and in Soviet camps, the death toll was catastrophic. But they also stress context. German soldiers were part of a regime that waged brutal war. The Allies' use of their labor was technically lawful as reparation, and indeed Britain, the US, and France all justified POW labor as owed work for wartime devastation. Modern scholarship, drawing on archives from all sides, seeks to balance these views. For example, one recent study shows that Soviet authorities did attempt to comply with Geneva-type standards. Officers were separated, rations were intended to match Red Army norms, and deliberate mass extermination was avoided, partly because Moscow feared international retaliation. At the same time, it acknowledges that the Soviets' primary motive was economic. The Soviet government initially detained the POWs as a labor source to aid in post-war reconstruction. Today, the POW experience occupies an ambiguous place in memory. In Germany, it is not forgotten, but remains colored by the complexity of guilt and suffering. Many Germans remember relatives who never came back, or who returned too broken to rebuild. Monuments and books, often subtitled Fronts and Prison Camps, recount the story of Kriegskinder, war children, who grew up without fathers. In Russia and Eastern Europe, memories of German POWs are often intertwined with memories of war and occupation, and sometimes remain politically sensitive, as when a Russian schoolboy was accused of rehabilitating Nazism for acknowledging that many Wehrmacht soldiers were simply unwilling conscripts. The historian's task has been to document and analyze this large human aftermath. Based on archives, they estimate that in total, the Western Allies took roughly 7.7 million German captives, while the Soviets took about 3.3 million of these, essentially all in the West, and most in the East eventually walked free, though for many it meant a decade or more in foreign lands. The fate of each group, whether the farmhands in Iowa or the laborers in Siberia, was shaped by geography and politics. What becomes clear is that war's duty to the defeated does not end with surrender. International law had required that captors care for prisoners. The Allies largely tried to meet those obligations, albeit under strain. And after the guns fell silent, new obligations arose to feed the hungry, return the distant, and reckon with the past. The saga of the prisoners of the Reich is ultimately a post-war story of how Europe grappled with defeated enemies, of retribution versus reconciliation, and of the millions of personal endings written in those quiet foreign camps. It reminds us that for every war's end, there follows a long aftermath of lives upended and slow healing.